She was 21 years old, and she had been thrown out. Not asked to leave, not given a timeline, not offered the soft phrasing that people use when they want to do a hard thing and feel better about themselves for doing it gently. Thrown out is the right phrase, and she had decided, somewhere in the first week of sleeping in her car in the parking lot of a 24-hour laundromat in Keld, Wyoming, that she was going to use the right phrase, because using the wrong one would mean accepting someone else's version of what had happened, and she had stopped doing that. She had a sleeping bag, a car with a slow oil leak she'd been watching for 6 months, and a $1 bill she had found in the zippered inside pocket of the duffel bag she'd packed in 40 minutes when her stepfather told her she had 24 hours to be out of the house she had grown up in. She had kept the dollar in that pocket through 8 nights in the laundromat parking lot and 4 nights in the car at the trailhead south of town, folded small. Not because she was saving it for anything in particular, but because having one thing that was entirely hers to decide about felt, in the geography of that month, like a form of navigation. And with that dollar, Rowan Gale bought a shepherd's cabin on 11 acres of high-elevation grassland in the Absaroka Range foothills, 12 miles from the nearest paved road, that the Sublette County Land Office had been trying to transfer for 7 years without finding a single taker. People in Keld said the old birch cabin wasn't a cabin anymore, just the idea of one. The county building inspector had called it a liability in language that was careful and official and meant that nobody would be blamed when it eventually fell down. But what no one in Keld knew, and what there was no mechanism for anyone to know, was that inside the stone chimney of that cabin, packed into a gap behind the fireback, between the fireback and the outer stonework, sealed with a plug of fitted granite and fire clay that had been set there with deliberate precision by a man named Willa Birch's father before the mountain took him, was something that had been waiting in the dark and the cold for 51 years for the person who came next. The person who would be willing to come up a mountain for $1 when everyone else had decided the mountain wasn't worth it. Something that would change Rowan Gale's life completely and prove, without anyone having to say it, that the people who throw someone out have a way of being wrong about what that person is capable of. That is almost mathematical in its consistency. If this kind of story reaches you, a story about what you find when you're willing to go where other people won't, we'd love it if you'd subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. And in the comments tonight, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Rowan Gale had grown up in a house on the edge of Keld proper, a ranch house with a long porch and an attached garage that her stepfather, Neil Garth, used for projects he started and did not finish. A rebuilt carburetor on a workbench, a deer head waiting to be mounted, a set of kitchen cabinet doors that had been stripped and were awaiting staining since approximately the middle of the Obama administration. Neil was a man who had opinions about everything and was right about fewer things than his opinions suggested, and who had come into Rowan's life when she was 9 with the specific confidence of a man who has decided the existing household arrangement needs adjustment, and who had spent the following 12 years making adjustments. He was not physically frightening. He was the kind of frightening that erodes rather than strikes, the steady pressure of a person who corrects everything you say, dismisses everything you value, and tells you often enough that you start hearing it in your own voice that you are too sensitive, that you are overreacting, that you are making things harder than they need to be for everyone. Her mother, Grace, had loved Rowan with the real and terrible love of a person who also needs someone to need them. And Neil had needed Grace in ways Grace had mistaken for a long time for devotion. Rowan had seen the shape of this clearly by her late teens. She had also seen that saying so would cost more than she could afford. So she had graduated high school, gotten a job at a veterinary clinic in Keld, She was good with animals in the way some people are good with things that don't require language, and had saved with the single-minded patience of someone saving for a departure rather than a purchase. She had saved $3,000 by the time she turned 21. The conversation with Neil happened before she could use it, on a Thursday morning in October, while Grace was at her sister's in Casper. Neil told her she was an adult. This was his house. She had 24 hours. He said it with the controlled calm of a man who has been waiting to say something and has practiced the saying of it. She had looked at him, at the garage behind him with its unfinished projects, the cabinet doors stripped and waiting since approximately the middle of the Obama administration, and she had packed the duffel bag in 40 minutes and not looked back at the house when she pulled out of the driveway. She drove to the laundromat because it was open at 11 at night and lit, and she knew the owner, a woman named Gina, who worked the counter until midnight, and who had the practical warmth of a person who has seen enough of the world's difficulty to have stopped being surprised by it. Gina did not ask questions. She gave Rowan the Wi-Fi password and brought her a coffee from the back and made no indication that she noticed Rowan's sleeping bag in the back seat of the car outside. Rowan worked at the clinic during the day and spent the evenings at the laundromat and slept in the car, and was methodical about it in the way that she was methodical about things that were hard. She did not call Grace, because Grace was at her sister's, and because the call would go to Neil eventually, and she was not ready to have a conversation with Neil that involved the word back. It was the vet she worked for, a woman named Dr. Pam Okafor, who found out. Dr. Okafor had the attentiveness of someone who is trained to read the signs that animals show. The signs of stress, of pain, of something being wrong that cannot be said in language, and she had transferred this attentiveness to people some time in her career, and now applied it to both. She found out on the 3rd week, not because Rowan told her, but because she looked. She offered the couch in the clinic's back office without ceremony. Rowan took it for 2 weeks and then refused to take it any longer, because there is a line between help and dependence that Rowan had always known precisely where she stood in relation to, and she had reached it. She moved to the trailhead south of town, which was legal for overnight parking as long as you didn't stay more than 14 consecutive nights, and she managed this by driving to the laundromat every 2 weeks and then back, which meant she was always technically starting over. She kept her job. She kept her bank account building. She kept the dollar in the duffel bag pocket. She was managing. And managing was a word she had learned to treat with respect, because managing was what you did before you could do something better. And the doing something better was coming. She could feel the shape of it, even when she couldn't see the form. It was a man at the county land office named Walt Prue who told her about the cabin. She had been in the land office on a different errand, trying to understand the property listings in the county's affordable housing inventory, which was a document that had been last updated in 2019 and was not particularly affordable. And Walt was the kind of county employee who has been in the same office for so long that he has become the institutional memory of it. Who knows where every file is and what every parcel looks like, and which pieces of land have stories that don't fit in the official record. He mentioned the birch cabin almost as a footnote, the way long-tenured civil servants mention things that have stopped seeming relevant because nobody has done anything with them. We've got a parcel up in the foothills that's been surplus since 2016, he said. 11 acres. Old sheep station, there was a cabin, the Birch family used it through the 50s. Roads impassable in winter. County can't maintain it, can't sell it, can't do anything with it. We'd take $1. Rowan looked at him. I know, he said. It's a long way up and the cabin's in rough shape. How rough? He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. The stone walls are sound. The roof failed in 2009. There's no floor to speak of, no utilities, no road access between November and May. He paused. The chimney's intact. Stone chimney, original to the 1890s build. That's the best thing about it. She asked how long the drive was from the trailhead. He told her 12 miles and then 4 miles on foot once the road became impassable, which in the current season was immediately. She asked what $1 bought her. Clear title, he said, and our gratitude. She drove back to the trailhead, found the $1 in the duffel bag pocket, and drove to the land office the next morning. Walt had the paperwork ready. She signed where it required signing, showed her Wyoming driver's license and the reference letter Dr. Okafor had written her when she thought Rowan was applying for a veterinary technician program, which she had thought about applying for, and had not. Walt stamped the transfer form. He looked at her across the desk with the expression of someone who has been waiting to hand something off to someone adequate and is uncertain whether he has. "The chimney," he said again, as she stood to go. "Solid stone. They built those to last." She thanked him and left. She drove to the trailhead south of town and then hiked the 4 miles in the October cold with the duffel bag on her back and the car locked at the road's end. The trail went through stands of lodgepole pine and then opened onto high grassland that rolled in brown October waves toward the mountains. The kind of landscape that does not comfort you exactly, but that tells you exactly what it is, which is its own form of honesty. The cabin appeared after the second ridge, stone walls, as advertised, the gray limestone of the Absarokas, still standing to full height on 3 sides. The fourth wall partially collapsed where the roof had pulled it when it went. The roof itself was gone entirely, except for 2 rafters on the north end that had stayed when everything else fell. She stood in front of it for a long time. The walls were extraordinary. That word arrived, and she kept it. Because it was accurate. Whoever had built this, August Birch, in 1891, who had run sheep on this grassland for 40 years, had built it with the patience of someone who understood that at this elevation, in this wind, in these winters, precision was a survival choice, not an aesthetic one. The stone courses were level, the mortar joints still tight after 130 years in the way of lime mortar properly mixed and cured. The corners were quoined, large interlocking blocks that distribute stress across the wall rather than concentrating it at the joint. She did not know the word for this yet. She understood the principle completely, because it was the same as every good thing she had learned to do. Distribute the load. Don't concentrate the stress. The chimney rose from the north wall, massive, built from the same stone, standing 4 feet above where the roofline had been. Wide enough at the base to have been a cooking fireplace as well as heating, at this elevation in winter that was arithmetic, not excess. She put her hand on it, cold, dry, the mortar in the same condition as the walls. She looked into the firebox. The fireback, the rear wall of the firebox, was a single cut slab of local stone, fitted tight, but not mortared in. She could see it even from the front. The slab sat in a channel cut into the firebox floor, held by its own weight in the surrounding stonework, but not bonded. A panel set in a frame, removable by design. She filed it and did not act on it yet, because she had not earned the right to pull things apart, and earning that right meant understanding the structure first. She spent the first night in the roofless cabin, in the sleeping bag, in the corner of the south wall that still had the most height and offered the most wind shelter. She built a small fire in the firebox. It drew perfectly, the flue clear and the draft strong. A chimney built by someone who understood updraft, and she lay in the sleeping bag and watched the fire and looked at the stars that were now the ceiling and felt something she could not immediately name. Something that was not happiness exactly, but was related to it the way a foundation is related to the house that will be built on it. In the morning she examined everything again. Slowly, she paced the interior dimensions. She looked at the collapsed fourth wall and understood that the collapse was recent, 15 years since the roof failed, and that the wall would have stood for another 100 years if the roof had held. She looked at the remaining rafters and understood the roof structure from the evidence of it. She took notes in a small notebook she had been keeping since the trailhead. Not a diary, a technical record, the same kind she had kept at the vet clinic about each animal's condition and what it seemed to need. She looked at the fire back for a long time. Then, she built up the fire again, let it burn until the firebox was warmed through, and let it die back and cool, and when the stone had cooled enough to touch, she ran her hands along the edges of the fireback slab. There was a gap, narrow, consistent, deliberate, along the top and sides of the slab, the kind of gap that is not the settling of mortar, but the tolerance of a fitted joint. She put her fingers at the top edge and pulled toward her, gently, and the slab moved. Not easily. It was stone, cut precisely to the channel, and it had 51 years of temperature cycling behind it. But it moved, a quarter inch, and then with steady pressure it slid forward into the firebox, and she lifted it out and set it aside. Behind the fireback was a space, the gap between the inner firebox wall and the outer stonework of the chimney, perhaps 18 inches deep, the full width of the firebox, sealed on all sides by the chimney's outer stone, a built-in void, deliberate, accessible only through the removable fireback. And in the void, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff and dark with age and temperature, was a bundle approximately the size of a shoebox and a rolled document tied with twine. She carried both to the south corner where she had slept and sat down in the morning light. She unwrapped the oilcloth from the bundle first. Inside was a tin box, the kind that had once held tobacco, sealed with electrical tape layered over itself many times, the tape dried and cracking at the edges. She worked the tape off carefully and opened the lid. She found a letter on top. It was dated June 14, 1973, and it was signed by a woman named Willa Birch. The handwriting was unhurried, neither large nor small. The hand of someone who wrote because she had something to say, and said it directly. Willa Birch had been born on this land in 1931, the daughter of August Birch's son, Harold, who had inherited the sheep station and run it until the sheep market collapsed in the 1960s. She had spent her childhood summers in this cabin, had learned to move sheep on this grassland, had learned to read weather from the mountains and water from the way the grass grew, and the location of deer in the early morning. She had married a man named George Birch, a cousin, she noted, without apology, which was not unusual in ranching country in that era. And they had worked the station together until George died in the winter of 1971 of a heart attack he had while checking the fence line in a blizzard, alone, in the way that solitary work in extreme terrain is always at risk of ending. After George died, she had stayed on for 2 more years, because the land was hers, and because leaving felt, she wrote, like giving George's death the final word which she was unwilling to do. She had left in 1973. She was 42. She had a daughter in Lander who needed her closer. And the station was no longer viable as a working sheep operation, and she was no longer willing to be 12 miles from help and 4 miles from a road. She had understood, leaving, that the cabin might stand empty for a long time. She had understood that whoever eventually came up here would find a ruin, or something close. She had decided, the week before she left, to do what her father had told her to do before he died. Her father, Harold, who had told her when she was 30 and he was dying that there are 2 kinds of things you can leave behind. Things that say here I was, and things that say here is what I learned. He had told her the second kind is always worth more. So she had written it down. That was what the rolled document was. She had written down what she knew about this land. this grassland, these 11 acres in the Absaroka foothills. The soil composition by section, mapped by hand. The water sources, the springs and the seasonal streams, and the one permanent spring in the northeast corner that had never failed in 40 years of her memory. The grazing patterns of the grass, which sections rested and which produced, and in what rotation. The wildlife corridors, where the elk moved in fall, where the deer bedded in summer, where the hawks nested on the south ridge. The weather signs specific to this location, the cloud formations that preceded bad weather here that were different from what the general forecast said. The wind shifts that meant a front was coming 12 hours before any instrument would show it. It was, she wrote in the letter, a knowledge map of a specific place, the kind that takes a lifetime to accumulate, and that dies with the person who holds it if no one writes it down. She had also put money in the tin box. She wrote about this after the land record, in the same direct hand, without ceremony. She had sold the sheep and the equipment and the truck in 1973 when she left. And she had taken what was left of Harold's savings, which were modest, and her own savings from the station years, and she had put them in the box in cash because she did not have the time or the legal confidence to arrange a proper transfer, and because she trusted the Chimney. She was a woman who had learned to trust what was built well, and the Chimney was built as well as anything she knew. She hoped, she wrote, that whoever found this was someone who needed the land more than the money. She hoped they would read the document and understand what the land was capable of, and treat it accordingly. She hoped they were young enough to use it and stubborn enough to stay. Rowan sat in the south corner of the roofless stone cabin, at an elevation of 7,200 feet in the Absaroka foothills in the October morning, and looked at the letter in her hands, and looked at the mountains, and looked at the tin box, and did not move for a long time. She opened the tin box. The money was in bills, old but legal, bound with rubber bands that had dried and cracked. She counted it twice, the way she counted anything that mattered, carefully, completely, checking the total against itself. $44,000. Old money, in denominations from the early 70s, each bill still tender, still real, still the thing it said it was. She unrolled the document. It was 6 pages, hand-drawn and handwritten on drafting paper that had stayed dry and flat in the oilcloth and the chimney's warmth. She read all 6 pages once, slowly, the way she read things that required her full attention rather than her casual attention. She read them again. What Willa Birch had written down was, she understood by the second reading, more valuable than the money. Not more immediately useful. The money was immediately useful, and she had 44,000 reasons to acknowledge that. But the knowledge map of the land was something that would take a lifetime to accumulate from scratch, and Willa Birch had done the accumulating and had written it down, which meant Rowan had received, in 6 pages of drafting paper, the working understanding of an 11-acre place that would normally cost 40 years of living there. She thought about Willa Birch writing it down, about Harold Birch telling his daughter before he died that there are 2 kinds of things you can leave behind. She thought about her own father, her biological father, who had left when she was 3, and of whom she had no memory that was not assembled from photographs, and she thought that this was a different kind of inheritance than that. A better one. The kind that arrives not through blood, but through the decision of a person who understood what they knew and chose to give it away. She spent 3 days at the cabin before she went back down the mountain. She read the knowledge map every evening, in the firelight from the chimney that still drew as cleanly as it had in 1891. She identified the permanent spring in the northeast corner, which she found on the second afternoon by following Willa's directions, south from the lightning-split pine, east along the contour, into the hollow where the ground stayed green, and which was running cold and clear and had, as Willa had written, never failed. She walked the sections Willa had mapped. She found the hawk nest on the south ridge, empty in October, but there, the sticks and down, and the whitewash on the rock below. She felt the wind shift that Willa had described as coming before weather, and then watched the front come in from the northwest 12 hours later, exactly as described, and she stood in the roofless cabin while the first snow of the season came through where the roof had been, and thought about what it means to know a place well enough to predict it. She went back down on the fourth day. She drove to the county land office and asked Walt Prue for a list of contractors who did high-elevation stone and timber work. Walt gave her 3 names and told her which one he'd use, which was more useful than the list. The contractor was a man named Pete Sorensen, who drove up the following weekend in a truck with oversized tires and walked the property with Rowan for 4 hours without saying much, which she had learned to recognize as the behavior of someone who was calculating rather than being dismissive. He gave her a quote for a new roof, timber frame, metal roofing that would handle the snow load, properly insulated. He gave her a separate quote for the collapsed fourth wall. He told her the chimney wanted nothing except cleaning, which he said with a respect she recognized as genuine. He said he could start in spring, when the road opened. She had $44,000. She spent the winter at Dr. Okafor's clinic. Dr. Okafor had offered the back office again with the firmness of someone not taking no for a second time, and Rowan accepted with the grace of someone who has learned that the difference between dependence and support is what you do with what you're given. She paid a small rent each month because it was the right thing to do, and Dr. Okafor accepted without argument. She read everything she could find about high-elevation grassland management, soil conservation, low-input grazing, the sheep breeds suited above 7,000 feet. She read about artisan wool production, which had an economics she found more interesting than expected. She checked her notes against Willa's knowledge map and found, on several occasions, that Willa had already understood what the academic literature was just now articulating, which told her something about the difference between knowledge that comes from books and knowledge that comes from 40 years of watching grass grow. She drove to Lander in February to find Willa Birch's daughter. It took 2 calls and a third to a neighbor who knew the family. The daughter's name was June Birch Castillo, and she lived in a house on the south side of Lander with a wraparound porch and a stock dog decal on the rear window of her truck. Rowan knocked. June was 63, compact, with the look of someone who has spent most of her life outdoors and made peace with what that does to your face. She looked at Rowan, then at the truck, then back. "You bought the cabin," she said. "For $1, Rowan said. June pushed the door open wider. "You'd better come in." They sat at the kitchen table. June listened to all of it, the fireback, the tin box, the letter, the 6 pages of drafting paper, with her hands flat on the table and her eyes steady. When Rowan finished, June was quiet a moment. "She told me she'd left something up there when she drove away in '73. Said it would find the right person eventually. I thought she meant the land." She looked at her coffee. "I didn't think she meant all that." "The knowledge map especially," Rowan said. "She knew that place better than she knew anything else. Better than she knew people," she used to say, though she didn't mean it unkindly. June looked at Rowan. "Are you going to bring the sheep back?" "I'm thinking about wool specifically. The market's changed." June nodded slowly. She'd have understood that. She was practical. She paused. "She would have liked you. She would have wanted to know you." They talked for 2 hours. Before Rowan left, June went to a back room and returned with a photograph. A woman in her 40s standing in front of a stone wall with mountains behind her, squinting in bright sun. One hand resting on the wall the way you rest your hand on something you have built and trust. "You can have it," June said. She should be there. Rowan put it in the breast pocket of her jacket where the dollar had been. Pete Sorensen started work in April when the road opened. The roof went up in 3 weeks. He had 2 men who knew high-elevation work and a crane that could reach the ridgepole from the cleared area below the cabin. And the timber frame went up in 4 days of coordinated work that Rowan watched and assisted and learned from in the way she had always learned from watching people who were good at what they did. The collapsed wall went back up in the 2nd week, Pete directing and Rowan lifting and fitting stone, which she did adequately enough that Pete mentioned it, which was his version of high praise. By June, the cabin had a roof, 4 walls, a floor Pete had put down in local pine, and the chimney standing through it all, unchanged, as it had stood since 1891. Rowan hung the photograph of Willa on the north wall, above the fireback that had kept the secret for 51 years. She built a fire in the firebox and watched it draw, clean and strong, and thought about the people who had built fires in this same firebox for 60 years, and the decades it had waited after them. She had 2 ewes by July, a Rambuya cross bred for mountain conditions, bought from a rancher near Dubois who had laughed when she said where the land was, and then looked at her carefully and said the location was hard, but the grass up there was some of the best in the county, which Willa's knowledge map had told her, and which it was satisfying to have confirmed. She brought them up the trail herself, one at a time on leads, which took most of a day and produced, at the end of it, the sight of 2 ewes on the Apsaroka grassland in the July evening light with the mountains behind them, cropping grass that had been waiting for something to crop it. She sat on the stone wall of the cabin and watched them and felt something she was not going to name, because naming it would make it smaller than it was. On the first Friday of every month, starting in August, she hiked down the mountain and drove to the laundromat in Keld. She brought coffee in a thermos, good coffee, from a bag she bought specifically for this, because Gina's coffee from the back was the thing that had made the first nights bearable, and she thought the least she could do was bring the better version. She sat at the counter with Gina, and they talked about the sheep, about the wool, about what the winter would look like up at 7,200 feet, about Willa's knowledge map and the spring in the northeast corner. Gina listened the way she had always listened, without inserting herself into the story, and she asked the kind of questions that made the story sharper. Rowan never explained what the first Fridays meant. Gina never asked. Some things are understood by doing them, not by saying them. It was September when Neil called. She was at the cabin, in the evening, with a fire going, and Willa's photograph above the fireback, and the knowledge map in its folder on the shelf, and the sound of the sheep somewhere on the south section where the grass was richest in fall. The phone had signal from a single carrier, intermittently, from one corner of the cabin. She had found this through experimentation, the way she had found everything useful on this land. She looked at the screen and saw the number, and felt, from a long distance, the thing she had been feeling from a distance since October of the previous year. Not pain, not anymore. Something more like the memory of pain, which is different, which is only a shape. She answered, because she answered things. Neil said he'd heard she was up in the foothills. He had heard through the way things are heard in small Wyoming towns, which is completely and with detail. He said he'd heard about the cabin. He said he was calling to, and here he paused. In the pause of a man who has started a sentence with a purpose and arrived at the word he needs, and found it is not a word he is comfortable with. Your mother wants to know you're all right, he said. Tell her I'm all right, Rowan said. Tell her she can call me. A pause. She worries, Neil said. I know, Rowan said. She can call me. She ended the call and stood in the cabin in the firelight, with the photograph of Willa Birch above the fireback, and the mountains outside the window she had had Pete put in the west wall specifically to catch the evening light. She had been thrown out of a house on the edge of Keld, Wyoming at 21 years old, with a sleeping bag and $1 and a duffel bag packed in 40 minutes. And she was here. That was not a complicated thing when she let herself see it plainly. Here was better than there. Here was 130 years of limestone that didn't move. Here was a permanent spring in the northeast corner that had never failed. Here was wool growing on the backs of 2 ewes on good Absaroka grass. Here was what somebody left for her before they knew she existed. Here was the land and what the land could teach, and what she was learning, and what she would eventually, when the time came, write down for whoever came next. That was not nothing. That was, she thought, in the firelight, in the particular quiet of a stone building at elevation, where the wind is always present, but the walls do not acknowledge it. That was everything she had not known she was looking for, and everything she had. She was 21 years old, and she had been thrown out. That was where the story had started. But the thrown out was not the story. The story was what you become when the door closes behind you and you don't spend your energy trying to get back through it. The story was the mountain, and the chimney that waited, and the woman who wrote it all down and trusted the stone to keep it, and the daughter and lander who had been carrying the not knowing for 51 years and said, when the not knowing finally ended, that she thought Willa would have wanted to know Rowan. Rowan thought about that on the first Fridays, driving down the mountain. She thought about it in the way you think about something that is still becoming what it means. If this story reached you tonight, if it made you think about what somebody left for you before they knew you needed it, or what you might be building right now for someone you'll never meet, we'd love it if you'd subscribe to the channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And in the comments, tell us this. Has there been something in your life that you thought was the worst thing that could happen to you, that turned out to point you exactly where you needed to go? We'd love to hear your story. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.